Now, another aspect to understand when it comes to figuring out what the driving forces were behind apartheid is not just the fact that they felt they needed to separate the races because the races couldn't get along, but it's communism. Ah, yes, the C word. So very, very briefly, let me just sort of put this in context. So in 1917, the US came into World War I on the side of the French and the British. This created such a disproportionate amount of power that the Germans had to close off the Eastern Front by getting Russia out of the war. The way they did that was they shipped a whole bunch of Jewish communists into Russia, who then fomented a revolution, took over from the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks, and then destroyed Russia. It was horrendous. And millions of people starved to death because communism doesn't work. It's a horrible economic theory and a horrible and destructive and incredibly genocidal implementation when you starve to death, right? So what happened was when the communists got into power, they slaughtered millions of Christians because it's very explicitly atheistic, hostile to religion philosophy. So the Bolsheviks got into power and slaughtered a whole bunch of Christians. And so when Christians see communists trying to get into power, they feel it's us versus them. This is what the Germans felt when the communists were trying to get into power in Russia in the 1920s and 1930s. Sorry, in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s. They thought, well, God, if the communists get into power in Germany, they're going to kill all of us Christians. So that was one of the driving forces behind National Socialism. A bit of an overreaction, of course. So the Calvinists, the Protestants, they feared communism because of the communist genocide against Christians that had occurred in a variety of countries, in particular, of course, in Russia. Here's how one historian describes the Afrikaner relationship with communism. Quote, "The image of the Bolsheviks horrified the rank-and-file Afrikaner, eventually making the latter into probably the staunchest and most consistent anti-Soviet grouping on the planet. The horrors under Stalin sealed the fate of the communist philosophy in Afrikaner minds. It was not so much the socialist philosophy as the total disrespect for religion and human life that created in the staunchly Calvinistic Afrikaner nothing but utter revulsion. Afrikaners saw communism as the prime evil." So that the issue of race and communism went hand in hand for the Afrikaners is apparent in the fact that the National Party passed the Population Registration Act and the Suppression of Communism Act at the same time. The former was the first apartheid law that formalized racial classification, while the latter outlawed the South African Communist Party and defined communism as any scheme that encourages feelings of hostility between the European and the non-European races. Yeah, let me break this out for you very quickly. So, communism sucks. Communism is ridiculously bad at predictions. So, three basic things were supposed to happen in the communist theory. Number one, communism was supposed to inevitably grow out of late-stage capitalism, right? Agrarianism led to feudalism, led to capitalism, led to communism. It was inevitable. You didn't have to lift a finger, except it wasn't happening. That was number one. Didn't happen. So that's why there were all these revolutions, because, hey, I'm tired of this thing happening inevitably. I'm going to make it happen myself. Number two, communism was supposed to develop in the most advanced capitalist countries. Didn't happen because the workers kept doing better and better under the advanced capitalist countries, so they had no interest in communism, which is why communism took place in bass-backwards countries like, semi-feudal Russia and Cuba and North Korea and, god-awful places, Cambodia and so on. So that was the second failure. First was supposed to grow out of capitalism. Second, supposed to take place in advanced industrialized countries. Number three is that communism was supposed to vastly outproduce capitalism because communism is unfettered by all that confusing gotta make money stuff, no profit motive. It's supposed to be much more efficient. It really wasn't. So communism was having a hard time spreading. Capitalist workers didn't really want it. It wasn't going to be inevitable, and it was really underproducing relative to capitalism. Even with all the communist and socialist lies in the media throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the truth sort of came out. And so what the communists did was they said, you see, well, capitalism is racist. Racist, capitalism, racist, because apparently black and white means a lot more to capitalists than the color of green or money. So they said capitalism is racist. Now, one of the problems with that, of course, was that under capitalism, even the racial minorities began to do better. In the 1920s and 1930s, the black family was even more solid and together in America than the white family. Blacks were coming into the skilled occupations. There was a growing black middle class. This is very bad for communism because this was their last way to criticize capitalism and the last people they could agitate. They couldn't agitate the workers against capitalism because the workers liked it. So they could agitate the minorities against capitalism, but if the minorities did well, that would be bad, which is why you see people on the left always trying to help the minorities while always making things worse for them, as in the welfare state, which has been incredibly destructive and toxic to black families in particular. So that's something to understand, that the communists were openly saying, and we talk about this in The Truth About Immigration and also The Truth About the Race War, both available linked below and on this channel. Communists go in and start riling up the racial minorities against the dominant majority, whatever that happens to be. In this case, happens to be white. The communists come in and start riling up, and they want to use the blacks in South Africa to overthrow the white government. So the whites start segregating and having racist laws and anti-communist laws at the same time. Plus, of course, remember that the Afrikaners had seen the British rile up the blacks against them and had been horribly murdered and fought against and so on. And so they knew what was going on. They knew what had happened already, and they didn't want to see it happen again. So there's a long history of violence between blacks and whites in South Africa. Some the blacks' fault, some the whites' fault, of course. But the communists were actively attempting to turn the black population into a revolutionary force, given that the number of black members of the South African Communist Party greatly increased after its inception, and that the African National Congress, the current rulers and Nelson Mandela's party and so on, eventually allied itself with the Communist Party. Is it any wonder that the Afrikaners were suspicious of the black population? Nelson Mandela himself held a senior rank in the country's Communist Party. He was proven to be a member of the Communist Party after years and decades of denial of this. So the parallels between South Africa under apartheid and the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict are very obvious, often brought up by historians and the media. However, no sane person is suggesting that Israel should open up its borders, assimilate the Palestinian population, and give them full voting rights. What would happen in such a situation? Well, Israel would cease to exist. Would we expect the Israelis, who would quickly become a minority under this scenario, to go along with it peacefully given their historical relationship with the Palestinians? Of course not. Again, this doesn't justify things, doesn't make everything right, but context and perspective and history is important. Otherwise, we end up just throwing names and learning nothing. The institution of apartheid was not racism, but was designed to preserve the white population against the increasing communist militancy of the blacks. Quote, for leading thinkers in the National Party, such arguments about racism almost completely miss the point, because the security of the Afrikaners as a dominant minority, and not as a race per se, was what concerned them. The Cape Town Stellenbosch axis of the nationalist intelligentsia, which was the most influential lobby in this National Party, almost without exception defended apartheid not as an expression of white superiority, but on the grounds of its assumed capacity to reduce conflict by curtailing points of interracial contact. When races in human history across the world, when races come into contact, there is a lot of conflict. The joys of diversity and multiculturalism. It's not just race, it's religion too. Look at the Protestants in Northern Southern Ireland. Look at Bosnia. Look at Serbia. Look at the Middle East. You can see these conflicts going on all the time. It's race, it's nations, it's cultures, it's religions. We are kind of an in-group preference species. That's kind of how evolution works. And so they thought, well, we'll keep the races separate, then we can reduce the amount of conflict that is going on. And they set up these 10 tribal areas, and they said, we're going to make these their own countries, and we're going to put this tribe here and this tribe here, and everyone's going to just stop fighting with each other. Everyone go to your separate corners, go have your own countries. And they tried creating what we call Bantustans, and it didn't really work out for reasons that we'll get into a little bit later. So the granting of political rights to the Bantu, of the kind which would satisfy their political aspirations, was altogether impossible in a mixed community, since such a step would endanger the present position and survival of the European population. If this danger was to be avoided, and at the same time the Europeans were not to violate their own conscience and moral standards, a policy of separate development would prove the only alternative. See, the Europeans also knew the history of South Africa and knew that the Bantus had wiped out the indigenous population. when they first moved in a century or two before the Europeans. And so the Europeans knew that the Bantus were perfectly capable of wiping out a minority that they had strength and superiority over. They knew this history. So they thought, well, majority democracy is going to be kind of suicide for us. Say, well, the Europeans shouldn't have been there. Should the Bantus have been there? They weren't native to the population either. You can play these games forever. It is what it is. Or rather, it was what it was.